Hello. It's been a couple days because I forgot how to sleep. I was not sleeping. I felt like I couldn't fall asleep or stay asleep. And it's definitely just because I traveled and then changed time zones. But it was messing up my entire life. But now I'm back and everything is good. I just went to this place across the street and I've never gotten juice from them before, but they did the whole freshly squeezed situation. And so it's a very healthy juice. And it was also $7 for this. So pricey juice, but hopefully worth it. Aw. Pearl, did you miss reading The Power Broker? Pearl, when you were gone, Robert Moses and FDR started kind of working together a little bit better. She's heading to her spot. It's funny. This piano it's a keyboard, and so sometimes I turn it on, and then Pearl will be like, "What?" She does the cartoon cat arch surprise look when the piano makes noise, because most of the time it doesn't. Okay. Sorry, I'm almost in reading position. Also, last night I was up so late, but it was okay. I ended up sleeping fine. But David has this uncle who is one of the most interesting people ever. His uncle and cousin are both in academia, and one is an artist in Appalachia, and the other studies like the social linguistics of areas between China and Russia, which I just don't know about. And so it was so interesting. And they were bringing out this crazy Russian alcohol and Chinese alcohol that was very strong. So it was a fun night. But then we also kept drinking water. So then I felt great in the morning. Okay, anyway, blah, blah, blah. Page 323 is where I am. And I finished right at the chapter break. So this chapter is called New York City Before Robert Moses. I'm so excited. Now Robert Moses's eyes were turning again to the city around which, as a youth, he had wandered, burning up with ideas for its improvement. Nowhere had America's Great Depression struck harder than in America's greatest city. New York in 1932 was half-completed skyscrapers, work on them long since halted for the lack of funds that glared down on the city from glassless windows. It was housewives scavenging for vegetables under pushcarts. It was crowds gathering at garbage dumps in Riverside Park and swarming onto them every time a new load was deposited, digging through the piles with sticks or hands in hopes of finding bits of food. New York was the soup kitchens operated from the back of army trucks in Times Square. It was the men, some of them wearing Chesterfield coats and Homburgs. Don't know what a Homburg is, but I'm assuming it's expensive, who lined up at soup kitchens with drooping shoulders and eyes that never looked up from the sidewalk. New York was the bread line, the worm that walks like a man. Worm that walks like a man is in quotes. I don't know what it's a quote from, but now I'm really curious. Okay. Worm that walks like a man. It's on TV Tropes, and it's not obvious at all what it's quoting. I don't, because this is vampire things are coming up, and I don't think that in 1979 Robert Moses was quoting The Walking Dead. New York was the postman handing you the registered letter that you both knew was the eviction notice. It was the long queues that formed in the early afternoon at the municipal lodging houses, and it was the desperate haste of the men turned away to get one of the nearby bars which allowed customers who purchased even a single drink to sleep on the floor as long as there was space. Subways were truly for sleeping, and when patrolmen walked along station platforms rapping on souls, the men lying there arose without a protest, carefully gathering up their pallets of newspapers, shuffled onto a train, and rode to the next station where they spread their papers and lay down again. Um, More than 10,000 of New York's 29,000 manufacturing firms had closed their doors. Nearly one of every three employables in the city had lost his job. An estimated 1,600,000 New Yorkers were receiving some form of public relief. Many of those fortunates who had kept their jobs were underemployed, a euphemism for the fact that they worked 2 or 3 days a week or 2 or 3 weeks a month, or if they worked full-time, were paid a fraction of their former salaries. Stenographers earning $35 to $40 per week in 1928 were averaging 16 in 1933. Woolworths was paying full-time sales ladies $7 per week. Parents skimped for their dinner. By December 1932, many parents could hardly remember a time when there hadn't been skimping. But skimping was only forestalling the inevitable. There was meat on the table twice a week, and then once, and then not at all. Then there were no eggs. Parents could make their children feel it was an honor that they didn't have to drink milk anymore and could drink coffee instead, but the lack of a proper diet took a toll. Looking back, we can see quite a change, said one schoolteacher. The children haven't any pep. They don't seem like the same youngsters they were a year ago. They seem tired. They didn't seem to learn as fast, said a school nurse. When you go into a classroom, you notice a different expression on their faces. There is a strained, anxious look, not natural in children at all. Sometimes the things that outsiders didn't see were worst of all. Teachers didn't see the children whose families were poorest. Such children had dropped out of school because they had no money for car fare, lunches, or suitable clothes. Staffers at the city's free health clinics were encouraged by the fact that the number of malnutrition cases they handled was rising only gradually. Although by 1934, such cases nonetheless would account for 60% of all clinic work. That felt like the most sobering line of this entire intro. That's so malnutrition in 60% of the clinic cases is really sad. Then the staffers realized that many people suffering from malnutrition simply weren't going to the clinics because they knew perfectly well what was wrong with them, and they also knew that they would be unable to do anything about it. And no one could see a state of mind. All one could do was try to describe it, as Martha Gellhorn did. Everywhere, there seemed to be a spreading listlessness, a whipped feeling. I find them all in the same shape. Fear, and overpowering terror of the future. Big like line break. The city's government did little to help its people. The will to help was not the force that drove the government. That force was greed. During the 15 years in which Red Mike Hylan and then Beau James Walker had been chief magistrate of America's greatest city, the Tammany leaders who served under them had seemed motivated primarily by the desire to siphon the city's vast resources into a vast trough on which they could batten. Former Judge Samuel Seabury's investigation of corruption in the city, which had begun in 1930, had revealed how successfully this siphoning had been accomplished, exposing the bank accounts, running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars of literally dozens of city officials who followed one another to the witness stand in a seemingly endless procession that was dubbed the Tin Box Parade. After one testified that he had found $360,000 in his home in a tin box, a wonderful tin box. Then Seabury, the former judge, turned to the magistrates' courts. Witnesses revealed that hundreds of innocent housewives and working girls had been framed as prostitutes, and if they could not raise the cash to buy their freedom, had been jailed, sometimes for months, by a cabal of crooked vice squad policemen, court clerks, and magistrates. Shocked by the strangling in Van Cortlandt Park of one scheduled female witness, Her teenage daughter committed suicide a week later. The city listened in horror to the others Seabury paraded to the stand. So I think this is because the government officials are taking money from the government, and then they're trying to say that the money came from these other sources like tin boxes, or because someone's like a prostitute but actually isn't, is what I think this is, right? One told of helping Vice Squad patrolmen trail a young married woman as she inspected houses with a male real estate agent. When they had returned to her home and were waiting for her husband to arrive and conclude the transaction, the police broke in, frightened the real estate agent out of testifying, and arrested her. Other witnesses testified that when business was slow, the Vice Squad simply raided flats in Harlem and made wholesale arrests at random. I don't understand why that would happen. Also, hello if you're coming in. We just started chapter 18, and it's about the Great Depression in New York City, which, surprise, surprise, was very bleak. And we're talking about how people were getting arrested for everything. When Mayor Walker took the stand, people are getting arrested. Okay, so all the public officials are taking the city's money, and then they're trying to say that this money came from things because now there's corruption investigations. So they're like, all this money came from a tin box in my house, or like, all this money came from this woman who's a prostitute, and then they're just arresting a random woman type of thing. When Mayor Walker took the stand, "Don't look him straight in the eye," warned a Seabury aide, the judge's aide, familiar with Bo James's charm. The former judge stood sideways to Walker as much as possible while questioning him. Seabury revealed that the mayor had personally accepted more than $1 million in beneficences from firms doing business with the city. On September 1, 1932, when Governor Roosevelt was pondering whether or not to remove Walker from office, the mayor resigned and sailed for Europe to join Betty Monk Compton, last and loveliest of his paramours, thereby following a traveling precedent established by Robert C. Van Wyck, the first mayor, 1898 to 1901, of the Consolidated City, who had died in Paris, and the man who had handpicked Van Wyck for the job, Tammany boss Richard Croker, who had died in England. Surrogate John Patrick O'Brien won the special election to fill the remaining year of Walker's term, but he proved to be as much a creature of Tammany as his predecessors. While Tammany leaders were trying to persuade the electorate that they had no control over him, Bryan was replying to reporters who asked him who his police commissioner would be. "I don't know. They haven't told me yet." And during O'Brien's administration, local Tammany relief administrators would siphon off a big chunk of federal relief payments before they reached their intended recipients. Although a supplement would have been helpful, since federal payments averaged $17 per week per family. Tammany would try to use federal payments to build its political power, putting ward healers on relief payrolls under several different names so that they could draw several salaries for themselves. Also, my hair just blew and looked crazy. And the federal payrolls did not show whether the men receiving its money were the men who most needed it. In New York City, under Tammany Hall, the test for employment on a federal project was generally politics rather than need. Most applicants had to be cleared by their local Tammany leader. The one leader boasted, "This is how we make Democrats." Fun fact. Oh, okay, yeah. So all those, like 3 in a row, fled New York City in their retirement to avoid prosecution. And unfortunately, this is going to keep happening. I'm excited for the rest of the book. Even the city wanted to help its people. Even had the city wanted to help its people, it would have been unable to. The Depression had forced New York to total up at last the cost of its rake's progress, and that's capital R, capital P, under the Highland and Walker administrations. I don't know, when it says rake's progress, I don't know what that is. When Hyland became mayor of New York on January 1, 1918, the city's population was 5,872,143 in 1918. 15 years later, when Walker resigned, it was, any guesses? 6,930,446, an increase of 15% in 15 years. During that same period, the city's budget rose from 240 million to 631 million, an increase of 250%. The per capita cost of the budget increased by 200%. Year in and year out, between January 1, 1918 and December 31, 1932, the city's debt increased at a rate equal to $100,000 per day, until on the latter date, it had reached the staggering total of $1,897,481,478, a figure that was almost equal to the combined debt of the lower 48, of the 48 states. That was all there were, sorry. And that required an annual appropriation for debt service, the payment of interest and amortization of $209,960,338, almost a third of the entire budget of just interest and stuff. This is really crazy. I knew New York City grew in population really quickly, and I knew it had financial problems in, like, I don't know, 1900 to 1930-ish. I did not know that New York City's debt was the same as the entire 48 states. That's so crazy. Since jobs were the fuel of Tammany's political machine, a disproportionate share of the rest of the budget went to purchase that fuel. Between the day Hyland entered office and the day Walker left it, the number of city employees almost doubled, and their salaries, paid as political rewards at levels far above those paid for similar work in private industry, almost tripled. In 1932, they totaled $311,937,199. City officials acted as if they believed that budgetary gyre could go on widening indefinitely. They based their optimism on the fact that the value of taxable real estate in the city, the base of the city's tax structure, was increasing almost as fast as city expenditures. As a result, even while the city's budget soared, there was only a slight increase in the real estate tax rate. If the Hyland and Walker administrations had erected a huge superstructure of city expenditures, that superstructure was nonetheless resting on a base that they thought was steadily broadening. Even before the Depression, however, the rate of increase in the base had begun to slow down ominously. The annual percentage of increase in the value of taxable real estate in the city was 12 in 1927. But only 9 in 1928 and 8 in 1929. The Depression forced this key percentage down to 6 in 1930, 3 in 1931, 1 in 1932. And that's the rate in increase of, I think, the property tax or something. And the Depression forced up another key percentage, the percentage of real estate taxes, which the city was unable to collect. In the years between 1928 and 1932, this percentage was successively 11, 13, 15, 18, and then 26. I'm actually surprised that like 26% is the number of people that can't pay the property tax. I would think it would be higher. The uncollected balance of the 1932 real estate tax, the tax which had to finance the bulk of the city's debt service and current expenditures, was $137 million. The base on which the top-heavy superstructure of city finances teetered was shrinking, and it was shrinking fast. The superstructure began to topple. In desperation, the city referred its required annual payments to the teachers' retirement fund and expropriated sinking fund surpluses already obligated for small-scale public improvements. Unable, despite these expedients, to meet even its ordinary day-to-day expenses, it was forced to borrow to pay them at interest rates set higher and higher by bankers increasingly leery about the city's ability to repay. By 1931, even Jimmy Walker was talking about economizing. But the city's economizing capacity was limited because 1/3 of its budget was allocated for an all but irreducible debt service. And because of political realities, the city payroll had become the payroll of the Tammany political machine. And while a city might reduce the number of its employees or their salaries, it was less easy for a political machine to throw its retainers off the payroll or substantially reduce their stipends. City construction contracts had become the main ingredient of the rich swill of graft, to which the palate of Tammany leaders, including those party leaders who held high city office, had become accustomed. City officials could reduce a city's appropriations for construction, but men accustomed to feeding at a well-filled trough were far less ready to reduce their own portions. Even while talking economy, city officials made clear that they would not economize on construction appropriations or salaries. There was one exemption. One group of city employees, school teachers, were not part of the Tammany machine. In 1930 and 31, the city fired 11,000 school teachers. The 1932 city budget was the highest ever. The city proposed to finance it with a record increase in the real estate tax rate. Man, they're always screwing the teachers. But the day of reckoning for 15 years of Tammany rule was at hand. I'm finding this chapter really interesting. I did not know nearly enough about like local budgets and finances of governments during the Great Depression. I just always hear about like, I don't know, national stuff, Hoover and the New Deal. But the day of reckoning for 15 years of Tammany rule was at hand. When, in January 1932, the city attempted to float new loans to meet the payroll coming due at the end of the month, bankers, convinced that the loans could not be repaid if the city spent money during the coming year at the rate it proposed, refused to make them, unless the budget was reduced. The city complied by virtually halting all repairs to its physical plant. It refinanced $250 million of subway bonds, which the city had planned to redeem out of current revenues by selling long-term bonds in their stead, an expedient which loaded future generations of city taxpayers with a monstrous rapid transit debt. Still, the city's balance sheet reddened. By December 1932, it was forced to go hat in hand to the bankers again. And when new loans were made contingent on further budget reductions, it had no choice but to cut the salaries of city employees by 6 to 33%. And hundreds of millions of dollars in short-term revenue notes would be coming due in 1933, and there was no money in sight to pay them. This is really bad. Although Walker and O'Brien attempted to do so, it was a misleading oversimplification to blame the Depression for all of New York's problems. The truth was that the city had been falling further and further behind in the race to meet the needs of its people, in good times as well as bad, and under reform as well as Tammany administrations. The city's failure was most apparent, and the problems largest, in those categories of municipal responsibility in which the betterment of its people's lives required the construction of public works on a scale commensurate with the city's size. The concern of the People's Tribunes during the Low and Mitchell reform administrations, you really have to be like an insider to be reading this and be like, oh yes, the Low and Mitchell reform administrations. So the concerns had been for the people's welfare, but that welfare had been conceived of primarily as a lessening of the burden on taxpayers through governmental economy rather than through the construction of civic improvements whose cost would increase that burden. And while Tammany administrations had spent the taxpayers' money with a lavish hand, the taxpayers had received in return surprisingly little increment in life-improving steel and concrete, because the disproportionate amount of the city's budget funneled by Tammany into salaries, into patronage, left little money available construction contract appropriations. The quality of men added to the city's payroll, moreover, did not match the quantity, thanks to Highland's destruction of civil service safeguards. If there was a man less devoted to the merit system than Red Mike Highland, it was his successor. When Beau James departed for Europe, he left behind him, on the roster of the engineering staffs of the borough presidents, the staffs which alone, under the existing city charter, were empowered to draw the plans for major public improvements. He left behind a group of engineers, in quotes, of whom a substantial percentage lacked a high school diploma. Gasp. And this is when they were building all the skyscrapers. And the city's resultant lack of technical expertise crippled its ability to carry out or even conceive complicated public works. That's so crazy. I just got I'll do a little show and tell. I got this book that has not all but a lot of the best New Yorker cartoons, and it's I can't remember if part of it is organized by, oh wait, no, that's a different book. One of the books is organized like sort of by decade, and the ones from the 1930s were interesting because there were a lot of New Yorker cartoons about the unfinished skyscrapers, because like that was just like you walk outside and that's what you see, and it's like, I don't know, this just like the symbolism of it all is really crazy. But they're, yeah, I don't know where that other book is. This one is organized by topic, so it's harder. So the city's lack of technical expertise crippled its ability to carry out complicated public works. So did the amount of graft, the grease, which kept the Tammany machine moving smoothly. From condemnation awards, quote, every time the city built a school, a politician went into the real estate business. LaGuardia growled to okay, sorry, I'm just restarting that paragraph. From condemnation awards. Every time the city built a school, a politician went into the real estate business. LaGuardia growled to certificates of completion. Every step toward a public improvement required a payoff. Since contractors had to include the cost of such payoffs in their estimates of the cost of city construction work, their bids had to be inflated accordingly. The amount of steel and concrete that a city dollar purchased was correspondingly reduced, and the size of contracts the city awarded was not matched by improvements to the civic estate. Quote, the city did not get what it paid for, commented Fusion financial expert Joseph D. McGoldrick. Although it certainly paid for what it got several times over. For its single major public improvement, the construction of the independent subway system, the Walker administration had paid $800 million, approximately twice what outside experts said the job should have cost. And when the $800 million had been spent, substantial portions of the subway were still incomplete. And since the hands which city inspectors held out, palms up to contractors, could not easily be doubled into hard fists of regulation, the quality of public works in New York City was more than slightly suspect. See, this is like, I want a whole book about how the bad buildings fall apart. No fewer than 40 public schools constructed during Walker's administration had to be closed for major repairs, for ceilings that fell, roofs that leaked, stairways that collapsed, and plumbing that didn't work at all within 1 year of opening. The gap between the city's physical plant and the increasing needs of its expanding population had then been widening in virtually all areas of municipal responsibility. The total accomplishment of the Walker administration in public housing, for example, consisted of the rehabilitation of some of the tenements on one block. And the number of public hospital beds when Bo James left office was precisely the same as when he entered it. But because of the sudden burgeoning in the use of the automobile and then in the desire for active recreation, the city's failure to produce for its people was especially galling in precisely those areas in which Robert Moses had already produced, just outside New York City. So much. Highways, bridges, and parks. Yeah, I don't know how much graft is happening now. Now I'm so curious. It was really fun. I love going to I became a member at the New York City Transit Museum. You kind of have to go 3 times to become a member or for that to be worth it. And I was like, yeah, whatever, I'll go. And you have to bring friends too. So I'm going to be bringing all my friends to the Transit Museum. But yeah, it was really interesting to see like transit throughout the decades and how the city funds it and how like in the 70s New York City's budget was like it sounds like even a worse disaster than in the 30s, and so the transit just got so bad, and it was almost to the point where people weren't sure how much the New York City's subway system would even be able to be salvaged. But then it was. Anyway, yeah, I think it's really interesting, but I don't know nearly enough about it. New York was strangling on its traffic. In 1918, when Hylan took office, I need to see a picture of Mr. Red Mike Hylan. Red Mike Hylan, mayor. He was the mayor in like the 1920s, 1918 to 1925. Okay, in his picture, at least on Google Images and Wikipedia, he looks like, unfortunately, really similar to like FDR. All those guys back then had like the mustache and the glass. They all look kind of the same to me. If he has red hair, it doesn't really show because I forgot it's black and white photography. Wow. Okay, I'm looking at another thing about Red Mike Hylan, and he was a locomotive engineer for the Brooklyn Union Elevated Railway, and he was a longtime resident of Bushwick. I wonder where he lived. We could have been neighbors. He created the Port Authority of New York and created the city-owned radio station WNYC. Okay, so it seems like his legacy is not totally horrible and bad, but his legacy in terms of like budget, according to Robert Caro, looks not so great. But I'm glad he actually did do some good things. In 1918, when Red Mike Hylan took office, there were 125,000 motor vehicles in the city. In 1932, there were 173. In all those 15 years, not a single usable mile of arterial highway had been constructed within the city's borders. Motorists were forced to travel through or around New York in 1932 on the same local streets that had existed in 1918. Streets complete with intersecting traffic lights, and traffic jams, reporters had long since run out of adjectives attempting to describe. Oh, I wish we had a list of them, like scraping the bottom of the barrel for adjectives. I read somewhere, where did I read this? It might have been in this book, so if it was, I'm so sorry. But I think it was at the Transit Museum. And it was about how in like the 1920s-ish or like the teens, when New York's population was just exploding, mostly immigrants, and the city just couldn't keep up with infrastructure. Sometimes to cross a street if it was a certain area where it was really hard to cross, you would have to wait an hour. And that was I was just like, in 1913, Robert Moses had stood on a high bluff overlooking the muddy wasteland that was Riverside Park and had envisioned a great parkway running through it. In 1932, there was still no highway. The city had begun construction in 1927 of a west side elevated highway running along the waterfront from the Battery as far uptown as 72nd Street, the park's southern border. But the pace of construction had been so slow that, when the Depression brought it to a halt in 1931, substantial portions of the highway had not been built. Not that that mattered much, since neither had the entrance and exit ramps that would make it usable. And since there were no plans to extend the highway through Riverside Park, motorists heading for Westchester and New England still had to make their way through and add to the congenital traffic jams of Manhattan and the Bronx before they could reach the broad Sawmill River Parkway, which Moses had built down to the city line. Queens had once been the only borough with adequate through roads. Manhattan families heading for Nassau and Suffolk counties, once past the East River bridges, had not encountered serious delays until they reached the city line and the narrow roads beyond. But with the construction beyond the line of Moses's parks and parkways, the situation was now reversed. The lure of his creations had steadily increased the traffic flow through Queens, and its boulevards were inadequate to handle it. Furthermore, none of the boulevards lined up with a parkway, so drivers wanting to use one had to endure local streets before they got to it. As for Brooklyn, borough of churches, I didn't know that was what it was called. Its inhabitants had been praying for a way out of it for decades. There was, in the entire borough, not a single major thoroughfare. There was no way out of its vast center, no way to reach Manhattan or Queens or Nassau County, except via local streets. And the streets of Brooklyn, like those of Queens, were becoming more clogged every year. The population of the two boroughs increased by more than 1 million between 1920 and 1930. Wow. As for connections for automobiles, under or over the water, which separated the city's boroughs, there hadn't been one built in a quarter of a century. There's an asterisk, and then it says 2 connections had been built by the Port of New York Authority between the city and New Jersey. The Holland Tunnel, which opened in 1927, and the George Washington Bridge, which opened in 1931. But no connections from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Manhattan's motorists bound for the Bronx, Westchester, or New England, after crawling uptown through Manhattan's congestion, found when they reached Manhattan's northern boundary, the Harlem River, that the only way to cross it was to get the congested streets of the Bronx. To get to the congested streets of the Bronx was the Broadway drawbridge, only 3 lanes wide, and so crammed with pillars that traffic tie-ups at either end often extended for blocks. On an average day in 1932, the bridge was raised 14 times to permit the passage of ships. When one of these raisings occurred at rush hour, the tie-up could extend for miles. There's an asterisk. Northbound motorists could, of course, cross the Harlem River on one of 7 bridges that had been built years before. The newest was finished in 1910, miles to the south. But these bridges debouched into the most congested sections of the Bronx, miles from the parkways and other broad roads of Westchester. I'm going to read one more page. This is really interesting. The population of Long Island, concentrated in Brooklyn and Queens, was more than 4 million in 1932, greater than all except 8 states. But except for a few small and ancient ferries that plied the East River. Actually, I'm going to pause. In 1932, which 8 states do you think were more populous than Long Island and Brooklyn and Queens? I'm so curious because my first thought is like Texas and California because now that they're really populous, but I don't know if they would have been populous back then. New York would be populous. What else? I feel like Ohio, maybe. I don't know. There were a bunch of presidents from then. Okay. Most populous states in 1930. Let's see. Oh, perfect. There's a Wikipedia article about it. Let's see if I know who made no, I don't know who made this. Okay. The state rankings by population are New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Texas, California, and Michigan, and then Massachusetts. You know, I feel like I should have guessed more because I think I would have probably been kind of right. And yeah, California had 5,600,000 people. Let's see how many, and Texas had 5,824,000 people. Okay, anyway, it was a little detour. And Michigan still is, I think, the 10th most populous state. It always surprises me how big it is. Okay. But except for a few small and ancient ferries that plied the East River, the only way on or off Long Island for motorists was the same quartet of East River bridges that had existed in 1909. Long Island still didn't possess a single vehicular link with the mainland United States. The island didn't possess a single vehicular link with Manhattan Island north of 59th Street, where the Queensboro Bridge touched down. The Queensboro, in fact, was the only link with Manhattan north of Corlear's Hook, where the Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Williamsburg spans debouched traffic onto the already jammed thoroughfares of the Lower East Side. I really wish I had a map that worked for all this because I'm only working with like a partial head map and I don't know everything. On an average weekday in 1933, 238,277 trucks and cars, 3 times what they were built to handle, poured onto the East River bridges. The Queensboro carried more cars than any other span in the country. The inadequacy of the approaches to these bridges was matched by the inadequacy of their roadways. Built for horses, not automobiles, they were too narrow for cars and so slippery that, according to a police report, on the Brooklyn Bridge alone, 12 accidents were not uncommon on a rainy day. That's so scary. City officials had been talking for years about repaving the bridges, but no repaving had been done. They had been talking for years about widening their roadways, but no widening had been done. Although in 1932, the Queensboro Bridge had been open for a quarter of a century, the city had not yet gotten around to even marking the lanes on it. At either end of the bridge were traffic lights. When they were red, bridge traffic stopped completely. A 1931 police study found that during rush hours, the average driver, frantically shifting gears while trying to keep his car in an unmarked lane, spent 43 minutes negotiating the 1,182 feet of the Queensboro span. The city had created 2 additional lanes on the Queensboro Upper Roadway in 1931, but when the lanes were opened, it was discovered that there had been a slight miscalculation. The lanes were too narrow. Cars were constantly skidding their tires on the granite curbs. Oh, that just sounds, I'm just imagining being in like a Model A or Model T or whatever rickety car and you're just like on and off the granite curbs. That sounds horrible. The lanes had to be closed while workmen laboriously chipped away the edges of the curbstones. And the workmen would be chipping and the lanes would be closed for 3 years. The lack of new interborough bridges and tunnels wasn't due to a lack of ideas. New York was littered with evidence to prove that there had been plenty of those. But the evidence also proved how difficult it was in New York for ideas to become reality. I'm going to stop there. Thanks for joining. I'm excited about this new chapter. I really get a little lost with the bridges. I think I need to just like look at a map and really learn where. I know where the Queensboro Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge are because I use those, but I don't know where the other bridges are because I don't go to Westchester very often. So I know. I hope there's a master builder with a ruthless hand and an obsession with power that's coming. You read with Google Maps open. Yeah, I should be like you. I'm excited about this. I'm trying to get like a sense of what's going to happen in this chapter. I feel like they're going to talk about more of the city's budget. That's kind of fun. And it's not a very long chapter. There's only like, let's see. Actually, it is kind of a long chapter, but wow. Okay, and then the next chapter is chapter 19, to power in the city, TO, to power in the city. And the first sentence is so crazy that I am going to be looking forward to this chapter a lot. This is the first sentence of the next chapter. In New York City, 1933 was the year of the goo-goo. What is that? I don't know. I'm not going to look. Okay, bye. Have a good day.